Okay. Hi, Rina. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
It is so nice to be here with you. I just was like thinking this morning, like how awesome that our worlds collided. I was Googling galleries in Queens. I end up on this virtual exhibit site for something you're doing out of India. You're on the other side of the country as a professor in an institution in Wisconsin. I'm so glad our paths crossed. And I'm so thankful that you're here with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yes, my pleasure. Before we get started, I want to give your formal introduction so people know who we're talking to today. This is Rina Yoon. She is a visual artist and a professor of fine art at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design in Wisconsin. And with that, there's so much knowledge that you bring, Rina. Your work speaks for itself, but you also have such a beautiful story that goes with it. And I'm really looking forward to diving into that with you. So I'd love to start with from the beginnings. That's usually the best place to start off. You had moved to the U.S. from Korea, and in one of the things I read about you, you mentioned that this was a rebellious and a hopeful act. I'd love to know what that means to you and how you went from there to being an artist.
Yeah, so as any 17-year-old would be, I was 17 thinking about college, and I really wanted to pursue my education in fine art. And my family situation at that time in Korea, it just wasn't possible. And so I had some family connection in US. So without having any kind of plan, um, I just thought, okay, if I can't study art in Korea, I'm going elsewhere. And I don't have any plan, but anywhere that I can go, that's still an option, would be better than settling and doing what was available to me. So I decided to quit high school, and then I came to US, and somehow I ended up finishing high school and on to college and grad school and so forth. So how that sort of worked out for me, I think it was sort of um, kind of rebellious and unplanned and a typical teenager thing to do. But at the end, I think I was just super lucky that yes, I had to support myself all the way through. So I was kind of financially on my own since 17, but I managed, and I managed to stay on this path that I've always wanted.
Oh, that's so cool. It's so inspiring. It is so like you mentioned rebellious and I think it's also just so brave, like truly. But and we'll get into this later. You have so many wonderful connections to like the earth that you speak to and like knowing yourself. And I think that'll all come through as we talk about your work today, which I'm very excited about. Um, so we are going to, for the first time in this interview setting, be sharing our screen and like looking at the works at the same time, which is radical, wonderful, completely
Mhm.
makes sense. Um, and I want to talk a little bit about where these works are currently featured. So you are part of right now the Inko Centre is doing an exhibit called A Porous Membrane. Is that the name of the exhibit? And the Inko Centre is based in Chennai, India, and you are in Wisconsin, is where you teach out of. So how did that come to be? Because that's pretty awesome.
The connection is really pretty awesome. So um, I've been for the last 10 or 11 years, I've been going back to Korea to visit and stay at this Buddhist temple. And that's another long story. But anyway, so in the last 10, 11 years, I went 12 times. So I would go there and stay there. And each time, such a beautiful place. And it really has become sort of this transformative moment for me. And that was to find that temple. It's called Mihwangsa in the southernmost tip of Korean peninsula. So I would go there, and very often I would meet very interesting people. and just being there. And I've taken students there through study abroad. I've also taken my artist friends, colleagues, when we have shows in Korea. So this particular year, I think it was 2017, several of us from Wisconsin were invited to be in a show in South Korea. So we went there, and after the exhibition finished, we went to the temple. You know, if you come to Korea with me, you just go to the temple with me no matter what. So at the temple, I met Rati there. She is Rati Jaffer, and she was there from Chennai, India, and she was doing a 10-day silent retreat. So we met, but because she was doing her silent retreat, we couldn't really talk. So we whispered and said we only have, she could only talk for 15 minutes, but she heard that I was an artist in US and that she just wanted to meet me. So we talked, and turned out that she was the director of Inko Centre, which is Indo-Korean Cultural Center in Chennai. And then I said, one of the artists who was in the show in Korea, just right before, she didn't come, but she's a really, really good friend of mine, Normal Raja, is from Chennai. So I said, wow, she's from Chennai, and Normal goes home a couple times a year. You should meet. So I introduced them, and Normal, she's a visual artist and a curator in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So through that connection, we had 3 exhibitions in Chennai and South India. So Porous Membrane is curated by Normal Raja, hosted by Inko Centre, and Normal curated, that included 3 Korean American artists.
Wild. And it all originated from this connection while a woman was practicing like almost complete silence in a temple in South Korea.
Right. A 15-minute connection. And from there, so we had 3 shows. This is a show with just Korean American artists, but 2 other shows were artists, not just Koreans, but artists in US working with Korean paper, Hanji, and Indian artists who work with Hanji.
Amazing.
So yeah, the connection, I think that's, the most wonderful and precious thing is to make connections, just the way that I make connection with you.
Yes. It has been so fruitful in my life, like these little connections and really like cherishing them. And I can see how that's a big part of your story. I think what's also really cool about this Inko Centre exhibit is its virtual format. I don't know if I've really encountered a virtual exhibit as like thoughtfully done as this one before. Had this been your first virtual exhibit that you participated in, or the other, like, what was that experience like, and how did they manifest your art in that virtual world? Like, did you send them literal pieces of your work? Did they take photos? What's that like?
I think, during pandemic, even teaching, as that we teach virtually, we interact with people virtually. So I think we get very creative because we have this need to share and connect. Mm-hmm. So when Normal Inko Centre contacted Normal wanting to put a show together, and the way that the show was possible would be to do a virtual. So this was the show was, I believe, was planned pre-pandemic. And maybe during pandemic, I don't remember, but so this is my first virtual exhibition in a 3D way that you can navigate through.
Mhm.
And Inko Centre sponsored a video, have a videographer, and then Josh Hintz, who helped with putting the 3D together. So there are some tech savvy people who made that possible. So it was all filmed. The interviews took place in our studios and filmed in person, and the works were digital format, and that was, I think, there's a digital gallery that Normal curated and hung the show, which is quite interesting because I didn't know what it was going to look like until it happened, and we were all very, very impressed how it turned out.
Yes, I was blown away. I mean, there's separate rooms, like you can have a timed version you can maneuver through yourself. I think it's so important to be evolving with, or at least understanding the opportunities that are coming about through technology. And so the fact that you have had this experience, I feel like is going to be really valuable to your students too, as you're explaining how we just continue to accommodate for the ways the world around us is changing a lot. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of these pieces from the exhibit. I'm going to pull up. We start at the beginning here. So I love even the intentionality of the title of your works in this. So it was called Earth Between In and Yoon.
Yeah.
Yoon, thank you. And so would you like to speak a little bit to the naming of that, how that came about?
So Inyeon is a Buddhist term for how everything is interconnected, and nothing sort of stands alone on its own completely without being connected. And as I started going to the temple and learning more and studying more about the Buddhist teachings, and also through meditations, it really resonated. That term interconnectedness really resonated with me, because as an immigrant and someone who, I mean, it goes way back. I think that like wanting, the desire to find a sense of self or a sense of belonging, as you know, even back in Korea growing up, I kind of didn't really have that sense of home. And then of course coming to US, and I've been in US almost 40 years now, and just kind of still trying to figure out and still trying to question, like, where is my home, or where do I belong? Who am I? That identity thing, and the sense of self, and a lot of that was addressed and explored through my work. And then when I started really learning more about the Buddhist teachings, and learning that everything, we are part of everything. And so that kind of breaking down that kind of solid definition of, the names, right? Korean or American, and here and there, and I'm part of the earth, and also the earth resides in me.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started sort of like breaking down these hard defined terms, I had this sense of openness and liberation. That, of course, I am a woman, I am Korean American, and I am a lot of these things, right? I am a wife and a daughter and all of that, and a teacher. So those terms are important and necessary because that's how we stay connected with that. But that sense of self really expanded further, thinking that sky is me and I'm part of the sky, I'm part of the earth, and I'm part of the river is in me, and that I no longer had to try so hard to find the definition, but instead sort of kind of have much more expansive sense of self. So this piece came about, it's Earth between Yin and Yang. So I use the cast of my body as a starting point for the piece.
No.
So you can, if you kind of look here and there, you'll see my elbow, you'll see a hand, and the concave and convex forms are the cast of my thigh, my backs. And so as I started putting this together, using my body, that became like a terrain, the undulating terrain of Earth. And then I was also thinking kind of about how we emerge, how we come from Earth. And then at the end, we return. So we return home or we come from home. So that's how this piece started out and ended up. The material that I used are paper coils.
I'm going to zoom in. The next photo shows us, I think, a little bit closer, so you can really see these. This is so cool. I'd love to hear more about the coils.
Yeah, as you can see the detail, these are paper coils. And around the time that I discovered Mihwangsa and became sort of my spiritual home, I also learned this technique of paper coiling, which is a traditional Korean paper craft called jiseung. And so the technique is you take a strip of paper and then you coil them. And I started doing coiling as meditative practice. And when I coiled, I accumulated lots and lots of coils. And I started seeing these coils as lines that like drawing lines. And I wanted to construct kind of a form using these lines, and also as these lines sort of resemble like the sort of kind of muscles, tissues underneath our skin.
Yes.
So to me, it makes sense that they kind of sort of made this connection. So it's a very, it took me, I think 8 months of coiling every day. Your hands get a little sore, so I could coil for about an hour a day. So it's a slow process, and you can't just coil 1,000 a day, right?
Right.
You just have to do it every single day. So I coiled for about 8 months, I think. And then this piece is about 7 feet tall and about 12 feet wide. It took me 7 months to put it together.
Oh my gosh. So you mentioned the process of the coiling, and I don't have, I can't relate on that level to the amount of like hand pain, but for a few years, like once a year, I would make spaghetti pasta from scratch, and I didn't have a pasta machine, and I would go and I would cut the pasta with a knife to make spaghetti for like 4 people. And I remember like every time my hand would not be able to move after, and then I wouldn't do it for a year because I was so traumatized. But you for 8 months, like I'm thinking of that and applying it to you, and like that's just, I can't imagine how much like love and sweat and equity went into the creation of this piece. You mentioned too how it like, so if we move back to the big picture, like this is your body, and now that like you've said it, I can absolutely see it. But does that mean that you started with like tracing yourself on a piece of paper and then coiling it, or what's that like?
No, I made a plaster caster forms of my body, and so I had someone do it for
Okay,
me,
I was like, how do you do
and
that yourself?
yeah, and so I didn't do a cast of the entire body, but I wanted to use. So the arms are usually pretty easy. You put it, and then someone can put this plaster gauze on you and let it dry, and then pull it. And the back and um, and thighs. So people can recognize the hand and elbows there, but there's some other forms that you can't. But I can, because that's part of my back, that's part of my shoulder, it's part of my thigh. When you have the cast, then you can kind of see the convex and concave form. So as I do in most of my work, I don't have a sketch, and I don't know where the piece is going and how the piece is gonna be evolved. I do start with an intention, what it is that I'm hoping to do, but I am always driven by this unknown curiosity. So I started with an arm, and then I would do my elbow, and then I've got them separately, right? And then I'll look at it and go, oh, I'm going to put it together. So what do I need to do to put it together? So slowly it sort of became like guided by what those pieces are telling me to do. And so it evolved into this form. And at one point that I kind of would say, okay, I think this is good. And then I'll leave it there. And that's how I work. And I think if we try to maybe even make sense of things, that like the way we navigate through our life and through your encounters, and I think maybe it's part of me that I have this curiosity, and also sort of this risk taking tendencies that I'm an ultimate optimist, that I always think something's going to work out. So I just dive in, and and I stick with it. So as I was making this, even though I didn't know where this was going, and I couldn't tell you, like, I know it's going somewhere, but then it always goes. Something happens, and I always like to think that my hands are smarter than me, and my work knows more than what I know. So I just let it evolve and listen to what it's doing and what it's saying, and then I go with that.
I love hearing about your approach, and I think it's so valuable, not just to your art, but like you said, to how we live our lives. You also have just so many quotable phrases. Like, I wrote down so many things from when I've listened to your other conversations you've had with people, and one of them was that you said you carried, like, or anyone, we carry not just our present, but our body carries the experiences before our time and shapes us. And it sounds like that's similar to what you're saying here, of like your hands knowing more of where you're headed with this in your subconscious than you could possibly try to predict of it. Is that like similar?
Right. And I think because it's kind of same, it comes from the same sort of view that, we are all individual, we are all unique, but we're always part of our past. and part of our history. And what we do now will shape future also. So, I think that, as I get older, and also, through my studio practice, I've had a lot of chance and opportunity, a lot of time to kind of think about the things that I was born with. It's not just my life. I carry the lives of my ancestors, and their experiences and their pain, their suffering, and their wisdom. So then, so kind of, you know, whether it was sort of like you learned, or it's I think it just kind of like it comes with you, right? And your surroundings influence you, right? Your family background, your family history, really shape you, the person that you become. So we're always part of that, and I think, in also in Asia, in Korea, we there's kind of, we believe, the Koreans believe that you're born with so-called destiny, that you are here, and your path is already predetermined for you. And that's kind of getting into like your astrology and all of that. And I'm not literally buying into it, but the spirit of that is that, that, as you kind of live your life, it's important to understand, like that, it's important to listen, right? And to listen to yourself, listen to your body, and kind of try to be, I don't know, try to be in touch, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you articulated really beautifully. Like, I don't have the same specific like spiritual background. I'm not so familiar with Buddhism, but I think one of the great themes of what you're saying is like this patience with yourself, and the world, and like, you've talked in previous discussions about partly accepting and partly cultivating, and connectedness by letting go, which might sound like paradoxical to some people, but really I think is very complementary. And when you have that expansive mindset and that optimistic mindset, there's just so much possibility that comes from that. I imagine like this amazing work that's a cast of your body, but also multiple coils, and this Korean temple, Buddhist temple experience. It's just great to see how it all gets woven together in ways we couldn't have articulated to a T before they happen.
Thank you.
So the other component here, and we've talked about it a little bit already, and you mean your body was literally part of the previous work we looked at, but I love the background of the seed and the environment around it being influential. I'd love to hear more about these pieces from your perspective.
So these two prints are from my Earth Body series. This series happened before the coils. And this is around the time that I also started going to the temple. And I used images of myself here. And these are photo etchings. And thinking about, it's kind of connecting with the same Inyeon term too, that, if I was thinking about cultivating and letting go, and if I saw myself as a seed in this life. And as you know, a seed has its predetermined property, right?
Mhm.
So if it is to be a rose, right, or you know, an orange tree or something like that, you know, that's predetermined. And then everything else, the fate of the seed depends on all the other things: the soil condition, the wind, water, sun, all of that. And I'm very passionate about gardening, growing things, touching soil. And I was literally thinking, if I was a seed, and um, I um, I depend on a lot of the external surroundings, and sometimes some seeds, if you think about wildflowers, right, you know, it lands somewhere where it can't be cultivated.
Right.
But then you see sometimes in those tiny, tiny cracks on the pavement that something still comes out and grows. So it really is about this resilience of nature. And just like that, that we kind of adapt to um, the different things that happen throughout our lives. And some things we have to really work hard to make it happen. So, you know, but then sometimes like this external thing, right? The right amount of the wind or temperature, the sun, and the water, and all of that, that happens, that's not necessarily in your control. And and so you sort of like nourish yourself when you can and cultivate that sense of growth like that. But then there are other times, you know, as a gardener, I just know that no matter what you do, you know, you pour all your energy and soul, it just won't work. And you have to really accept it and you have to let it go. So I was thinking a lot about that. And in this series, I made about 40 prints in the Earth Body series. So each print that I'm making, I'm thinking about those things. So the acceptance and struggles. So one on the left, you know, it's kind of in the position of, this is actually a child pose in yoga pose. So, you know, it's a restoring kind of a pose, and imagining that if I were to grow a seed in myself, what kind of plants or flowers would come out of. And then one on the right is really literally, you know, a seed underneath the surface of the soil, waiting to push out or struggling to kind of push through that soil. And there is that tension that you have.
That is so cool. And I feel like a kindred spirit with you. I have this tattoo on my hand with a light bulb and there's flowers growing out of it. And to me, it's like the thoughts that I germinate in my head are what's going to be put out into the world. And so I see here too what you're saying of like, what is my seed going to produce in this ecosystem that we live in? I also, I keep coming back to the image you portrayed of like the seed that like really has no control over where it's scattered to, and it finds that little hole maybe in the rock and it grows. I'm a New Yorker and I was raised to be a little tough, I feel like, or like that was like the thing, you self-preserving, but you see fragility and vulnerability as positives. And I think that's really like beautiful and encouraging. And I feel like I see that here, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you think that fragility and vulnerability are really good for us.
I It's a friend this morning told me that the life is not all happy and it's not all suffering. So when things are going well, you know, things are going well. But I think that's both the good and, I don't know if it's a bad, but the like easy and difficult, right? You won't know easy until you experience difficult situation. So I think we are all very protective because we have to, like you said, we have to be tough sometimes, and often we tend to kind of get hardened, right? And because that's how you survive. And I, life for human beings, life for trees and plants and rivers, it's always hard. It's always a struggle. We always negotiate how to exist. And when I think about fragility and vulnerability, I think it makes us humble. It makes us aware that things are precious, and that until you honor or until you become more aware and kind of honor or respect the sensitive, in Buddhism it's called soft spot. And so it's the soft spot that could cultivate anger or cultivate hardness, hurt. But it is the same area, same place where you could also cultivate acceptance and compassion and forgiveness. So I think that fragility and vulnerability teach us to sort of be more in tune with the things around us.
Yeah, that's really helpful perspective. Thank you. So in the social work world, we talk about how a person's life is influenced by their upbringing, by the environment that they're surrounded by. And what stood out to me in your reflection on like your life in Korea versus the US, you mentioned like the individual self versus the collective self. And I wonder if that having the duality and the chance to experience both frames of mind could help with understanding these values of like being connected and what that fragility can bring about. Have you made observations in that way?
So I think when I left Korea as a teenager, I felt this kind of collective self, and my I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like I had to not just think of myself, but I'm a part of the community, and the kind of this conformity was weighing really heavily on me, because I wanted to do something that wasn't maybe the easy path, or wasn't lucrative path, so to speak. And my family situation couldn't quite support that. So some, like, as part of that, the family or the society, like, you do what is responsible or logical or reasonable thing to do. And I didn't want to do that, right? So that individual self, like, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do what I'm told, and I'm not going to do what is uh, 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 like reasonable, logical. Go to a state university and it's nothing bad, but like become an English teacher or something, or go to, I don't know, study accounting and become an accountant. But so then I came here, and for a long, long time, I'm thinking like, I, I, my individual self is at the core, and I want to really do what, I'm not going to do what I'm told to do, and I'm not going to, just to get married and have children and do this and have white picket fence and this and that, because I'm going to make those decisions myself, right?
Yes.
So now, though, I'm in my, mid 50s, and kind of, and also, having grown up in one culture and then spend almost all of my adult life in this culture, right? I'm beginning to really enjoy having both experiences, and having had this opportunity for those two things to sort of merge. And I feel really grateful that I can see it from this way and I can see it from that way, right? And so I that is kind of part of me, right? So that's I could sometimes, when I'm talking and talking to students or friends, or even in my own work, I recognize like a lot of my culture, my Korean culture, and then a lot of times, like, I don't have that. I have more, I don't know, American kind of mindset too. And before, when I was younger, and I was struggling in that kind of the opposite, the polar opposite, but now I find that to be quite interesting. And um, I I really embrace both.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I don't, there's a lot of overlap too. There isn't just kind of collective self and individual self that are so opposite from each other. There is no common ground, but actually there's so much in common too. So hey, I'm happy that
Yeah.
I can see both. Yeah.
I think it adds so much value to like your work and just your individualism in who is Rina Yoon, and she has Korean identity and American identity and artistic identity that all shine through. Um, One of the most like important decisions it sounds like that you made though was like, I'm not going to follow the charted path that, as I understand it, I'm going to be an artist. But from what I remember, you weren't maybe necessarily first dead set on this type of art, right? Maybe you wanted to be a painter first. So I'd love to even like go back down memory lane for a second and see how that happened, because this is so like cool. I didn't know about this type of art before we spoke, and I just would love to know how you were exposed to it.
Mhm. Um, yeah, I wanted to be a painter. I actually started my formal training in art. I think I was maybe 9 years old or 8 years old, through this formal sort of academic kind of art training. And my teachers were painters, and they were so very inspiring. So I said, I'm going to be a painter just like them, right? So it wasn't until I took printmaking class in college, and I think I was a sophomore in college, and printmaking was like one of the electives that I took. And that's when I found that I really liked the process. and printmaking fit my sort of like logical and intuitive personality really well. So I continue to take printmaking, but still I'm thinking, well, I want to be a painter. So my main focus was in painting. And then when I started thinking about going to grad school, that's when I kind of said, wow, what do I want to really do? And that's when I also recognized that the printmaking is something that I really enjoy, and also found it to be very challenging. And you know, like when you study printmaking, you are a life learner, because printmaking by its own nature is technology. So technology evolves all the time. And I started learning etching, and when I was, in college, and there's so many things. So I always tell my students, if you get bored easily and you want to be challenged and you want to learn something new, then printmaking is the right place, because I'm still discovering and learning. And and then whatever the new things that I learn, I apply it in my work, and then that really helps my practice to kind of be a new experience all the time.
It, it's such a fascinating process. I'd love to understand a little bit more about the origins of printmaking. Like, there were plates involved that we've talked about. There was different materials there, and then like contrast that to, or connected to, like your innovations and how your work is so expanded from that.
So yes, so printmaking really started with being able to make books, print books, have multiple, multiple. I mean, like, more than just one book. So prior to that, right, the manuscripts were handwritten, and it was not accessible to the general public. And in Asia, the Buddhist scripts weren't available to the others, to people. It was only for, let's say, if it was like, in Europe, that would be a priest or the king would have that power. And so anyway, so he started out with being able to have more than one book, handwritten book. So the multiplicity is inherent in printmaking. So you have a plate, and your image is, you make your image on a plate, whether it's a block of wood or metal or limestone for lithography. And that tradition continued for several hundred years. And so that kind of the inherent ability to make multiples has always been part of printmaking and part of a traditional printmaking. The last 30, 40, 50 years, the traditional process evolved and incorporated more technology. So instead of using a limestone, people developed aluminum plate, photo plate. So then, at the same time, the photography was really taking off, and the technology was evolving. Sort of printmaking, well, actually printmaking and photography were considered to be the same thing.
No way.
So that's why photographers call it print. Yeah, and so anyway, so then at some point it sort of went separate ways. So technology is always part of printmaking. It's process oriented. and you kind of have to work with the process. So instead of, if you're drawing, you draw directly on paper. But if you were to make the drawing on a plate, then you have to know how to etch the plate, how to process the plate, how to ink it, and how to run it through the press. So kind of like a photographers, they have to use a camera, right? So printmakers always work with equipment and chemicals and pressure and all of that. More recently, post-digital technologies such as 3D printing and laser cut, laser engraving, also CNC, computer augmented like technologies have all become or slowly started becoming part of printmaking language too. So the piece that it's up there now is laser engraved.
And that's the one on of the hands, or both of them?
Not the hands. So the piece on the right, the left and the right panels.
Okay.
The texture that you see, they are laser engraved on a printed paper. So I had a white piece of paper that I printed black, and then laser burned the surface of the black away, reveal the paper that underneath, that inked layer. So it's a laser engraved image of Yellow River in China. One on the left, not the arms, but you see that texture on the black. That's sort of this kind of delicate river mark, the I don't know, the zigzagging marks.
Yes.
They're laser engraved. So that's new technology that sort of that printmakers also incorporate. And there are all these tools, and I'm not very digitally savvy, but I'm always curious how my work will change when I change the process. So I'm kind of, I'd like to question, and I like to push the boundaries. So, getting outside of the rectangular shape, what is it like? Can I combine multiple processes in one print? So the one on the left has the laser engraving and etching and hand coil paper.
So cool. I love the idea of the boundary pressing. I think like whenever someone says no, it's more like, well, how can we? Like, what's keeping us from it? How can we push beyond that and innovate? I think are all really encouraging ways to look at challenges. I would love to, next time I meet a printmaker, say that I have some knowledge in the vernacular of the craft. So you've used terms before like intaglio. You talked about a maybe a more historic Korean process of hanji. Hanji. Are those? Am I seeing any of that here? Are those very different? What are those?
So intaglio is not very well known term. I think more people know about etchings and metal engravings and etchings. So intaglio is the way a print is made, and how intaglio print is made is intaglio means to cut. So when you make a mark and it's processed, that you get these valleys because it's incised. When you dig into something, when you scratch something, you create a little valley, right? If it's an etching, you uh, make your drawing, and then you etch it. So the acid gets into those lines and eat away the metal, creating these crevices.
Mm.
And then you ink that plate, so the ink stays in the crevices, everything else gets wiped away. So then you put a piece of paper and you run it through the press, and the pressure from the press pushes the paper down to the crevices, picks up the ink.
Oh my goodness.
So that is intaglio process. So instead of me explaining this whole thing, if you say this is an intaglio print, you know how it's printed.
You're right.
So yeah, so one on the left, on the arms, you see feather-like lines.
Mm-hmm.
They were intaglio printed.
Very
And then the black background with the texture that's a laser engraved.
mm-hmm.
And then the paper coils are the three-dimensional. So if you look carefully at on the left, on the arms, the tip of the right arm hand,
Yes,
it is white. So they were, I added hand coils to that. So that's the one that has the laser, intaglio, and hand coil combined.
I love how it's such a process, and you let me in on one of the falsities of printmaking, which is that like you don't know what you're getting, when in reality, in your perspective, you do have a sense of what you're getting, even though there's so many steps from A to Z to get there. Could you speak a little bit to how you ultimately know what's going to happen after all of those processes pass off?
Right. It's not just like you do whatever you do and then whatever comes out is what comes out attitude. There's always an intent. There is always an idea, whether it's, sort of your visual outcome, like expectation of certain visual outcome. But there is an intent. I'm making my image and I'm making marks, and I'm making those decisions with some idea in mind. When in printmaking, though, there is that surprise element because it's indirect. You don't always, if you were to draw on paper, you make a line and you see it right away, right? But there is a delayed sort of time. There's a time delay because you're making the mark on a plate instead.
Mm-hmm.
And then you don't really see it until you ink it, until you process it and ink it and print it. Somewhere along that way, the time has passed. And when it's printed, to me, it's kind of like a surprise. And so I'm always hoping that if it's going to be an accident, I want it to be a happy accident, right? And for the most part, they are, but there is that element of surprise because I made that line on a plate several days ago. And then it's being realized on a piece of paper later. So I love that. So now, because it's processed either through chemistry, chemicals, or in other ways, I think for me is they don't always turn out you think they're gonna be. So then you have to assess, right? Number one, you get, oh, right? You can do that. You can get disappointed, or you can say, oh no, or it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, let's see what I have. And or sometimes it can be like, wow, I did that, right? So all of those things, right? So it's not, it's a conversation. So I'm not the only maker in this, right? I'm collaborating with chemicals, with ink, with the pressure, with all these things. And printmaking is very tactile. So I'm always using my hands, whether I am making marks or scratching, scraping away. And it's very involved, it's very physical. And it also takes time too. And so I always feel like I'm coordinating. I am part of this process, and I'm probably more like a conductor, you know? So I'm conducting all this, and I work with different materials. And then sometimes they work, other times they don't work. Now, when they don't work, it's an opportunity to do things differently. So it tells me to react to it and see, oh, it didn't work. What can I do with it?
Right.
Now, when that fails, you can cut your losses and say, okay, move on, right?
Easier said than done, Rina. I don't know. That's so hard, I imagine, after you put so much time, but that's really powerful.
Yeah, but see, I think, I mean, you know, believe me that I have more failed work than successful work. And it is through that. So to me, nothing is waste of time. So I always make it hoping that it will work out. But when it doesn't work out, it's just, it's an opportunity, it leads me somewhere else. So it's just, there's no such a thing as waste of time or failure. You know, it's a learning experience. And I'm usually, I mean, I'm really okay saying, okay, all right, 2 months of that, okay, I can do something else.
But I think that is a really great learning. Like, failure is what we define it to be, or we don't define it to be, and we can say the goal has been learning. Like, this process taught me more about myself. It taught me more about the collaborating partners in the materials. Like, so I love that. And I think a great way to see that too is, for you, you've mentioned to me that, like, you don't know necessarily going into it what you're going to make even, and that helps you to not know what it has to be maybe at the end of it. But you did get some specific inspiration from the driftwood in your part of the country. Could you speak to what that was like?
Yeah, so this is my most recent project. I'm still working on this. And so I was um, on the beach on Lake Michigan, not last summer, the summer before, or fall, or somewhere around that time. And this particular beach that I went, I saw these piles and piles of driftwood. And then I kind of looked at each of them, and they, you know, I realized that they were once trees. Somewhere along the Lake Michigan, in Wisconsin, and maybe across Lake Michigan from on the Canada side. And so these were the trees near near the lake that fell and got sort of washed away into the lake and moved around, and at some point were deposited back to the shore. So they were already all cleaned up, broken and formed. So there's some huge trunks too, but I was really taken to these pieces. To me, they looked like bones. They felt like the remains of these trees, of the trees. And I was also taken by the shape that the water sort of change the limbs of these tree branches into a really beautiful organic curved shapes. And some of the branches were hollowed out because it got washed away. And also the barks were all cleaned in the water. So I really love these forms. So I collected a bunch. I brought them to the studio and I cleaned them. So if there's a dirt, sand, and some, grimes and stuff. So I cleaned these driftwood, and then I started coiling, thinking about, the Korean paper that I use, hanji, come from mulberry tree branches. They're harvested and they're cut, not the tree, just the branches. And then the tree, the mulberry tree will continue to grow, and then they keep harvesting. So paper is made from the inner barks of mulberry branches. And so I was just thinking about these tree branches that I brought them back, and the barks, the skin was already cleaned, stripped away. And I wanted to honor these branches, this driftwood, because they were once thriving and once part of these trees. So I started wrapping them, thinking that I'm clothing them and I'm honoring them, and kind of putting their skin back on, using the paper that also came from trees, right? So this is part of an installation that I'm working on called reliquary. So it's the remains of the tree, and as I'm cleaning, I'm literally thinking about dressing sort of the remains of the body and kind of like in funeral, right? You dress the body and you clothe the body before you send away. So it was, I spent about close to a year working on it. So I have about 100. I actually have.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. So yeah. So this is a project that I'm doing. It's also going to have a video and audio component to this piece. On the one side, there will be a video of the water, the Michigan water coming into the beach, the waves coming in, and me picking up the branches. And the other video, it's going to be 2-channel video. The other video is going to show me cleaning these branches and wrapping them in coils in my studio. And, continuing with my sort of connection to nature, that they look kind of like, when I brought them to the studio, they look like I laid them all down, and they look like this archaeological site where they dig up bones and, kind of putting them all together. So they remind me of that, and also reminded me of a Korean funeral tradition that when someone dies, um, you wash the body and clothe the body with a paper garment. So, I mean, I'm not trying to kind of be dark here, but it isn't, because it is a celebration of life, and you honor these, these little, these beautifully formed branches, and just spending time studying and spending time touching and covering, and each piece is so unique. So, like this particular one, the tail end is so beautiful. So I wanted it to kind of be more like feather-like. So I look at here's another one I cleaned, and this one's a little rougher and has little like holes, the like areas that's carved away. And this is going to tell me how it wants to be dressed. So I mean, like, this is my work table. So yeah, these are my coils.
Oh my gosh,
So
cool.
yeah, so I'll be working on this, and it's meditative, it's soothing, and it's fun, very
Yes.
comforting.
I think a recurring theme for me, or what I'm experiencing in your work, is just a lot of dignity. I think that there's dignity for nature, there's dignity for self, for process. And as we like have our final like moments together, and I can't believe it. I mean, I've learned so much and I'm so thankful. You are also a professor. And so there are people who get to benefit from this on even a more regular basis than I do. And I'd love to understand, I imagine not everyone who comes into your classroom has the same story, of course, and so they're going to use your example and the way that you have crafted your story and your art to inform theirs. How do you reconcile that as a teacher? Like, what are your aspirations for the courses that you teach?
So I don't really talk much about my own practice or my own work with my students. I don't want them to, I don't want their work to be like mine. If we share a lot of common ground, then I can share some of the things that I do. But I think for me, teaching and working with this very creative, a group of creative young people, and my role, I believe, is to help them sort of discover their potential and their creative voice. And that the direction can be, I mean, it could be from, I don't know, work, doing photography, or doing arts management, to painting or printmaking. I do offer skills. It's foundational, so techniques and skill-based teachings are necessary, because tools important. You have to know what you're working with, and you have to know how to work, handle your tools and materials well. But it's not about technique, right? So it's about being what it's like to live a creative life, and what it means to each of us, right? Each of them. So I think that kind of help them kind of figure it out, especially being a fine artist, isn't doesn't it's not the path of a fine artist is challenging.
Yeah.
And so, what's in it for you, right? Why, it's not a clear path. many artists, struggle to make a living and practice. So what is the value in that, and how do you kind of maintain that passion and find meaning in what you do? And it is such a valuable thing. And you don't even have to actually like be a studio artist, but that creativity is a wonderful thing. So I hope that with my students that I help them go through the downs, and then celebrate the ups, but most importantly, maintain that creative drive as your, life calling
Oh, what a rich
experience.
perspective. And I'm so thankful that you're cultivating that in this world and with our emerging artists. I'm so excited to see the ways your work continues to evolve and affect how I see the world as I get to view it. Rina, it's been really such a privilege. I've so enjoyed talking to you, and I thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. Yeah.
Oh, thank